Hello, Robs. We're back with Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor, Major General Frank Richardson, MD. Pick up at page 133. It was in the summer of 1803, not long after the beginning of Napoleon's friendship with Mademoiselle Georges, that Madame Junot had some curious experiences with the first consul. Laura Junot, later to become the Duchess of Abrantes, had been only 11 when Napoleon proposed to her mother, Madame Permon. And whether or not she knew that her mother had laughed at the idea, she herself had thought the young general rather a figure of fun. But by 1803, she had cause to be very grateful to a completely transformed Napoleon for considerable generosity to her and to her husband, whom he had made a general and the governor of Paris, during a visit to Malmaison. Rhymes with Paul Mazan. During a visit to Malmaison, whilst Josephine was taking the waters at Plombier, Laura Junot had reason to fear that she would have to make it plain to the first consul that her gratitude recognized certain limits. One morning, Napoleon entered her room at 5 a.m., sat on her bed to read his morning correspondence with an occasional remark to her, and after about an hour left her with an affectionate pinch, which seemed to her to threaten further developments. After the visit had been repeated the next day, she locked the door and told her maid to admit nobody. Sure enough, next morning the door was rattled, and she heard Napoleon talking to her maid. Shortly afterwards, there was on her bed again, having fetched the key and got in by another door. He was on her bed, that is. He was rather cross and asked her if she was afraid of being murdered. Have you ever thought of being murdered, bruv? And said that he would call her early next morning for a hunting expedition. That day her husband came for a visit, and though he should not have spent a night away from Paris without the first consul's permission, she persuaded him to stay. Next morning, Napoleon was surprised to find him in bed with her. Junot was even more surprised and asked Napoleon what he wanted with his wife so early in the morning. Napoleon, in a bit of a temper, reminded Junot that he could punish him for his absence from Paris, but agreed that Laura, or Laurie, I don't know how they pronounce this, Laure was the one who should be punished for persuading her husband to stay. This was the end of the strange early morning visits, and we are left with no explanation for them, except another pointer that Napoleon was, for some reason or other, strangely inhibited from developing completely normal, happy relationships with people. The next two ladies to be noticed, Madame du Châtel and Mademoiselle. What's the difference between Madame and Mademoiselle? And Mademoiselle Denuel have a certain significance, as they were pawns in the game played by the Bonapartes, and especially by Caroline and her husband Joachim Marat, to get rid of Josephine by throwing other women at Napoleon's head in order that he might beget children, and so prove that Josephine was responsible for the infertility of the marriage. Madame du Châtel was a very pretty young lady in waiting to Josephine, and Eugene, something tells me that's not Eugenie Beauharnais had been strongly attracted by her, until he found that she was simply using him as cover. Her elderly husband, 30 years older than herself, was a counselor of state. Fair, slender, accomplished, indeed, and intellectual, she was attractive as well as pretty, though with a rather beaky nose, a straw, if not quite a lift raft, at which poor faded Josephine could clutch. She was a coquette, but could appear cold and reserved when it was necessary to put Josephine off the scent. Caroline connived in arranging meetings between Napoleon and Madame du Châtel, and Marat cooperated by pretending to be in love with her himself. This affair began during the consulate and reached its height in 1806. It was something more than an innocent flirtation, and it caused Josephine prolonged jealous anxiety. Writers of contemporary memoirs, such as Madame Junot, Constant, and Madame de Remusat, refrained from naming Madame du Châtel other than as Madame D. One feels that Napoleon's infatuation cannot have long survived an occasion when, according to Bertrand, Madame du Châtel burst out laughing one evening at Malmaison and said, "Ah, so the Empress says that you are no use at all, that it's just like so much piss." This could hardly have been Napoleon's idea of a joke, and it is an indication of the moral climate of his court that a lady could speak or joke about such a subject to any man, let alone to the emperor. Once, when Josephine caught Napoleon with Madame du Châtel, he so hotly resented her spying that the most terrible scene took place. Napoleon smashed everything within reach, threw Josephine's own infidelities in her teeth, using the cruelest language of which he was capable, and threatened to go ahead with the divorce immediately. As usual, Josephine got out of this scrape by resorting to tears, violent quarrels, and affectionate reconciliations, which many novelists and playwrights seem to regard as the central ingredients of marriage, were very much a part of life with the Bonapartes. Even after this, Madame, if I say Mademoiselle one more fucking time, even after this, Madame du Châtel calmly denied her guilt when at last Josephine, encouraged by Napoleon, who was very wary of Madame du Châtel, gave her quite a kindly homily about her indiscreet behavior and the need for a young woman like her to consider her reputation. At one time, she certainly delighted in parading the fact that she was Napoleon's favorite and could humiliate Josephine. For Madame du Châtel, it can at least be said that she remained faithful to the end, gracing Napoleon's court during the 100 Days and paying a farewell visit after the final abdication. The fuss which Josephine made about Madame du Châtel and some other mistresses suggests that Napoleon was indulging his need for self-justification when he told Bertrand that Josephine had herself encouraged him to take mistresses in order to keep him and to stave off the divorce. Fortified by her eventual triumph over Madame du Châtel, Josephine, the only woman with whom Napoleon could really relax and be himself, had little difficulty in breaking up a half-hearted affair with a Mademoiselle Lacoste. She was one of Josephine's readers, so she presumably had time on her hands, since Mademoiselle Avrillon, the lady's maid, testified that no one ever read a word to Josephine. Napoleon's care for the reputation of his family circle might have prevented him from having much to do with Louise Catherine Eleanor Dunel de la Plaine, if his sister Caroline and her husband had not deliberately organized an intimate association between this member of their household and Napoleon as part of their untiring campaign to separate him from Josephine. Despite her aristocratic name, to which she was probably not entitled, Eleanor Denuel was the daughter of very shady parents and was the separated wife of an adventurer, the bogus Captain Raval. Her claim to respectability was that she had been for a time at the aristocratic school of Madame Campan, where Hortense Beauharnais and Caroline Bonaparte had been educated. This helped her to get employment with the Marats as a reader, a kind of secretary. Her role in history was to provide Napoleon with evidence that he was capable of becoming a father, and thus to further the schemes of the Bonapartes and bring the divorce of Josephine did I just say Josephine? Josephine, one step nearer. Napoleon at first gladly accepted the paternity of her son, born in 1806, but was later tortured by doubts, which were shared by Josephine and Hortense, her daughter, who knew all about the affair. These doubts, which have been shared by many historians, will be examined in some detail in Chapter 10. Meanwhile, we may regard Napoleon's acceptance of her child as his son as another turning point in his sex life. The road to divorce and remarriage was now clear. My God, are these people a bunch of twats? I hate these people. 4 years after the birth of Eleanor's son, Napoleon claimed to be the father of another boy, a child of love this time rather than the result of a calculated experiment. This was the son of Marie Woluska, the beautiful young Polish countess, whose love for Napoleon has inspired romantic novels, plays, and films. Of her love for him there seems to be little doubt, but it is not so easy to be certain about his love for her. Marie Woluska was nearly 19 years old when she first met Napoleon, and she had been married for about 3 years to an elderly Polish nobleman to whom she had recently presented the son. She had been strictly brought up and was deeply religious, with high moral principles so deeply instilled into her as to be her second nature, if we can believe most of the books about her. But overriding everything was her intense patriotism, and Polish patriotism then, as ever since, was passionately devoted to restoration of the independence and sovereignty of the beloved country. Her tutor, Nicholas Chopin, was the father of Poland's great composer and patriot, Frederick Chopin. When at the age of 16, she was offered a choice of two suitors, she rejected the younger one because he was a Russian and chose to become the wife of a rather senile old man because he was Polish, Count Woluski, the Grand Seigneur of the district, who had rendered distinguished services to the last king of Poland. But he was over 70. What? She was 19 and he was 70? All right, well, there you go. His youngest grandson was 25, nearly 10 years older than herself. So wait, she married him at 15? Oh, man. Nearly 10 years older than herself, and Marie's life in his ancestral castle cannot have been very exciting. When she decided to drive with a friend to see and welcome Napoleon on his way to Warsaw, it was no passing whim to relieve the tedium of country life. The name of Napoleon had been a household word in her family since she was 9, and from the age of about 15, she had cultivated a hero worship for this mighty conqueror, who might one day reestablish Poland as an independent kingdom. Never mind my stomach. It is not at all surprising that the glamour of the growing Napoleonic legend should have captured the imagination of this romantic, intensely nationalistic young girl. When men like Hegel and Goethe had hailed Napoleon as the messiah of a new order in Europe, and Beethoven had learned of the emperor's coronation only just in time to tear the dedication page from his Sinfonia Grande Napoleon Bonaparte, which we now know as the Great Eroica. Older Polish women were going into rapture over Napoleon and spoke of him as seeming to be almost divine. So it was in a state of high excitement that Marie Woluska and her friend joined the crowd at the post house of Brani and begged General Duroc to help them to get a sight of the emperor. Napoleon was enchanted, as with sparkling eyes this lovely girl breathlessly made her little speech of welcome. But although he gave her a bouquet with some meaning glances and warm words about future meetings, she barely realized the passion which she had aroused. She had not long to wait, for as soon as news of the emperor's interest in her began to spread, as a result of his insistence that she must be found and brought to court. The leading Poles, realizing the possibility of using her to influence Napoleon, spared no pains to gratify his wishes. It is quite painful to read of the relentless pressure which was applied to her by Prince Poniatowski and others, and by her family, including her rather stupid old husband, who knew nothing of the encounter at Brani, and thought that all this insistence on her attendance at court was a tribute to his own position and past services. Marie was appalled when she realized what was expected of her, but she seems to have been alone in thinking that it was too high a price that she should be encouraged to give herself to Napoleon for her country's sake. Other Polish women said that in her place they would have felt honored. There really must have been something quite out of the ordinary about that man. The extent of the extent of Napoleon's infatuation is shown by the fact that in his letters he actually made half promises to help Poland for Marie's sake, though he never allowed women to influence his political decisions. Of course, she had to yield in the end, but she went down fighting, which greatly intrigued Napoleon, who seldom encountered such maidenly resistance. She rather offended her relatives and surprised Napoleon by going to court in a simple white gown with a garland of flowers. She kept Napoleon at arm's length, quietly evaded his flirtatious advances, and refused to play his little game at table of wearing the flowers which he had given her, and touching them when he laid his hand on his heart as a sign that she would return his love. In fact, she pointedly told him that she had given his flowers to her baby son, and clearly indicated that she was hoping against hope that he would fulfill his promises to help Poland in return for a purely platonic friendship. When the pace quickened, she was alarmed and offended by his ardent approaches, and dissolved in a passion of weeping which greatly disconcerted her hopeful lover. She said later that at first she had worshipped Napoleon from afar, but close up he terrified her. In the end, this romantic girl, very young though not inexperienced, was worn down by the relentless pressure of Polish statesmen urging her, for the sake of her country, to respond to Napoleon's wooing, which by now was both ardent and somewhat rough. She claimed that finally, whilst Napoleon was vigorously persuading her to yield, and threatening that if she refused he would crush Poland as he crushed his watch, which he then flung down and ground beneath his heel, she fainted. Finding when she recovered that Napoleon had been able to consummate her sacrifice, she saw no point in further resistance. However, in fact, it has been said she was virtually raped. You think? She was passed out and he fucked her. That's called rape, friends. That's rape. Thereafter, however, his magnetic, almost feminine power to charm and a gentleness which he could practice when it suited him finally won her heart, and her surrender seems to have been more wholehearted than that of any other woman in his life. Perhaps she was helped to love him by memories of her childhood hero worship. Perhaps she came to understand the immature side of his nature, his need for reassurance in the sexual sphere, and found this somehow touching in the great conqueror, and appealed to her maternal feelings. She told him that she was surprised that a great general should indulge in such schoolboy tricks as the sign language used between him and Duroc. She never got the reward for which she had made her ultimate surrender, but she gave him a pure, tender, unselfish love, which it is hard to discern in any other woman in his life except perhaps Desiree, who was never given a chance. Now it was Napoleon who was finding excuses to prevent Josephine from joining him at his field headquarters. A very different story from those old days in the Italian campaign. He took great precautions to keep this love affair secret from Josephine, though of course this was not possible after Marie had joined him in Paris. Josephine deliberately threw the attractive young Mademoiselle Guilbeau in his way in an attempt to detach him from Waluska. Marie's complacent old husband surrendered her to Napoleon, and a separation was quietly arranged. Thenceforward, Napoleon was to Marie her all, her future and her life, as she told Constant. A son attributed to Napoleon was born on 4th May 1810. And Marie's husband generously allowed her to have the child at his castle of Walois, so that he was officially recognized as a Waluski. When Marie returned to Paris after the child's birth, Napoleon's life was filled by his new empress, and he could spare little time for his mistress, but she stuck to him through all the changes that lay ahead, and it was she who came to console him in his dark hour after his first abdication. She waited for a whole night, but although almost everyone had abandoned him, including his wife, he never sent for her. He regretted this and said to Constant, "She must have felt humiliated, poor woman. Tell her when you see her how sorry I am. But I had so many things here," touching his forehead. It was Marie Waluska again who came to see him in Elba, and as she brought the 4-year-old Alexander with her, local rumor insisted that the secret visitors were the ex-empress and the king of Rome. The faithful Marie, after a visit cut short by Napoleon, was hustled off the island, made to take a perilous ride in darkness along rocky paths to embark on a night of rising storm, which made Napoleon momentarily fear that he had sent his true love to her death, in his eagerness to avoid compromising himself in a way which might give Marie Louise a further pretext for not joining him in his exile. Himself, that was all he usually thought of. But this time it may have been a little different. Caulaincourt, who knew better than most men how cold and unmoved Napoleon's heart could be, may have discerned something unusual in Napoleon's feelings for Marie. In 1812, during the long sleigh journey after leaving the army in Russia, he had the greatest difficulty in preventing Napoleon from turning aside to visit Marie at the castle of Walois. Though this, or is it Walois, though this would have greatly increased the risk of capture at the region, as the region was swarming with Cossacks. During the 100 days, Marie Waluska was by his side again, though Marie Louise, for one reason or another, stayed in the enemy camp whilst her husband was making his last magnificent attempt to recover all he had lost. Marie Waluska, again unlike Marie Louise, was willing to share his exile in St. Helena, but was not allowed to do so. In 1816, she married Count d'Ornano, a cousin of the emperor, who at one time been a colonel in the Imperial Guard. She bore him a child in June 1817, but did not recover from this confinement, and died some 6 months later. Napoleon, who had been annoyed to hear that his discarded mistress, Pauline Forres, had been taken on by his successor, General Kleber, felt piqued and abandoned when he learned of Marie's marriage. This reaction, like Napoleon's generosity to those who had been his mistresses, and the interest which he continued to take in them, strikes me less as an estimable trait than as a symptom of his egotism. He tried to bind them to him for life, as if he felt that to have been loved by the great Napoleon, or even to have been used by him, should last anyone for life. But Marie Waluska clearly meant a lot to him during the years of her wonderful, selfless devotion to the selfish creature. It was not without good cause that his face assumed an expression of slightly contrite gravity whenever he thought of her, which Claude Manceron tells us was noticeable to his intimate friends. Marie Waluska was unquestionably Napoleon's most loved mistress. Was she also the last? Historians have been unable to agree about whether Napoleon had affairs in St. Helena, particularly with Madame Bertrand and Montholon. With anyone else, it was virtually impossible. As is so often the case, it all boils down to which gossip one is prepared to believe. Napoleon himself well knew how vulnerable he was to scandal. When Esther Vesey, a servant in the Bertrand household and the mistress of Napoleon's valet marchand, had a baby, he said cynically that he would assuredly be accused of making her pregnant, since valets were always blamed for royal bastards. Jean Savant, an assiduous purveyor of gossip, states bluntly that the Countess de Montholon gave Napoleon a dote, her husband being complacent. Oh, wait, I was supposed to stop at this part right there. As he was to get several million francs for it. Lord Rose said, well, maybe we will just stop. No, just continue. We'll finish this page out. The Countess de Montholon gave Napoleon a daughter, her husband being complacent, or is that complaisant, as he was to get several million francs for it. Lord Rosebery did not deign to notice the scandal. Frederic Masson calls Madame de Montholon a worthless intrigante and a retired courtesan, and concludes that la femme y joue son rôle. Voilà tout. We know, plied her trade in the island. Is a rather pointed translation. In the American edition, R.F. Delderfield, like Masson, reserves judgment, and another modern historian, Dr. Paul Garnier, who devotes 3 volumes to Napoleon's life in St. Helena, finds the Montholon canard hardly probable. Octave Aubry, also unconvinced, quotes the opinion of Dr. Verling that Madame Bertrand had been half hysterical when she told him that Madame de Montholon's second daughter, born in St. Helena, might very well be the Emperor's daughter. Madame Bertrand herself did not escape the scandal mongers, but most historians agree with Masson, who exonerates her completely. Joseph Turquois mentions the rumors of distractions, but holds that Napoleon was faithful to Marie-Louise to the end. The opinion of Tig, I don't know how you say that name. Someone's got that name. Tig, I'm gonna say Ty Hopkins, that there is not an ounce of proof about the scandals, is shared by Monsieur Gilbert Martineau, the French consul in St. Helena, and today's foremost authority on Napoleon's life in the island. In the island? He was in it? St. Helena was overcrowded as a result of Napoleon's incarceration there, and this particularly applied to Longwood House, where Napoleon lived with the Montholons, the bachelor General Gourgaud, and his valets and other domestic staff. General Bertrand and his wife lived a short distance away at Hut's Gate. Albine de Montholon had been twice divorced for adultery before she married Count de Montholon. Captain Maitland found her quiet and unassuming on board Bellerophon, but his judgment for once seems to have been faulty. Masson's opinion of her is shared by many. She set her cap at Lieutenant Basil Jackson and other British officers. She ably abetted her husband in the game of jockeying for position in Napoleon's favor, and did her best to enliven the earlier years of Napoleon's exile before he had decided to resign himself to his fate. And to ensure that history regarded it as martyrdom, she may well have tried to captivate him, but suggestions that her husband was paid several million francs to allow her to become the Emperor's mistress are typical of the canards which embellished Napoleon's life, and it is pleasant to see that Vincent Cronin, in his book Napoleon, like the great Lord Rosebery, does not deign to notice them. It's really, honestly, it sounds like TMZ. It's fucking disgusting. Come to hate this book. I fucking hate it, bruv. I hate it.